Chapter IV of Recollections of a Missionary in the Great West by Cyrus Townsend Brady. This recording is in the public domain. In one of the border towns we had services in an abandoned saloon. The building was not in a very good location for a saloon. That's why it was abandoned. But it would do very well for a church. Any old place would do for that, you know. So we cleaned it out and fixed it up nicely. The town had been a very wild one, and the saloon had been one of the worst there, which is saying a good deal. Men had been killed within its walls, and some grim, ominous stains under the chancel carpet, which, like Rizzio's blood, could not be washed out, told the story. But one of the best missions I ever served was located just there. Services were held on one weekday, afternoon and night, every 6 weeks or so, as I could get to them, and were so popular that nearly the whole town attended them. A wandering and somewhat dilapidated amusement company, a concert troupe I think it was, once drifted into the town and made arrangements to give a performance on the night appointed for the services. Very few tickets were sold, and when they inquired the reason, they found out that almost everybody was going to church. They came to us then with a pitiful tale, which their appearance bore out, of hard times, bad luck, and small houses, and wanted to know if we could not help them in some way. They said that if I would appoint the hour of service for 7 o'clock, they would postpone their performance until 8:30. Besides, they would give me a free ticket, and all hands come to my show if I would go to theirs. I accepted their offer, of course. They were all interested attendants at the service, and I believe they reaped a fair reward by their compromise with their own performance afterwards. That is the only instance on record, so far as my knowledge goes, where a theatrical company postponed its performance for church services. One summer afternoon I found myself 27 miles away from a town down in the Indian Territory. I was due there in the evening for services and a wedding. When I went down to the station in the afternoon to take the train, I found that heavy rains and a cloudburst had washed out the bridges, and that no train would be sent through until the next day. For the same reason it would be impossible to drive, so I determined to ride. A friend of mine, who, because he was the agent of the Standard Oil Company in that country, rejoiced under the name of Coal Oil Johnny, offered to get a couple of horses and show me the way. So I telegraphed ahead to the anxious bride that I would be there that night, a little late perhaps, but that I would surely come. I strapped up some vestments in a little roll and put it on my shoulders, as I had an idea of what we might expect, mounted the broncos, and away we started. I have ridden many broncos, but this was the worst I ever rode. To be strictly accurate, I would hardly say that I rode him at all. I managed to stick on, and that was all. He bucked and kicked and bit and shied and stopped and balked and did everything for which his breed is famous. It sometimes seemed to me that he was doing all these things at the same time. When he made up his mind to go, however, he went like the wind. On the old principle of being in Rome and doing as the Romans, I soon learned that the cowboy method of letting the reins hang loosely, lifting them high in the air, digging in the spurs, and yelling frantically in his ear was the best way to accelerate his pace. He would run, and continue to run like a frightened deer, as long as the notion seized him, and a nice dignified spectacle we must have presented at such times. It was exhilarating, but dangerous, for the ground was full of prairie dog holes, hidden in the buffalo grass, and we never knew when the bronco might put his foot in one, break his leg, and perhaps kill his rider, to say nothing of the dog. Coal Oil Johnny's horse was quite as bad as mine. He said he had meant to give me the better of the two, but mine seemed the worst, perhaps because I rode him. They had strapped on my boots a pair of Mexican spurs with rowels like shark's teeth, which annoyed me very much more than they did my bronco. Every time I inadvertently touched him he had a fit. However, they were the only things by which he could be coerced in any degree. We had to swim 2 rivers and 1 creek. I had crossed them a few days before on the train. They were almost dry in their beds. Now they were roaring torrents. This is a common occurrence with those streams. We forced the horses in the swirling muddy water of the river, and when we got into the deep water, slipped out of the saddle, and retaining tight hold of the high horn, swam alongside to relieve them of our weight. The current swept us down the stream with fearful velocity, and it was only after a long hard struggle that we reached the other bank, a long distance below our starting point. We were forced to mount while the horses were scrambling out of the water, or we would have had great difficulty in getting into the saddle again. The other streams not being so deep nor so swift, we remained in the saddle. When I was in the deep water and touched him with the spur, I found that I finally had the advantage. He couldn't buck or do anything but hump himself and snort, both of which he did with great vehemence. Late in the evening we reached the town. Pretty much the whole population were out on the sidewalks, including the groom and friends of the bride, and amid wild cheering and laughter, the two wet, bedraggled figures rode down the main street, both horses reserving this particular moment for the final exhibition of their general and entire wickedness. I could just manage to walk to the church that evening, for I never was so sore and stiff in my life. We had a pretty wedding, though the converted saloon was only decorated with tumbleweed, and the carpet upon which the bride walked to the groom's spring wagon was of the kind popularly known as rag. For the bride was pretty and the groom was manly, and after all, those are the things which count. I said that the bronco was the best possible horse for missionary journeyings, and so he is. He is an ugly, ill-tempered, vicious, cross-grained, undersized, half-starved, flea-bitten, abandoned little beast, and he gives the missionary abundant opportunity to practice the sublime virtue of self-restraint. As a horrible example of total depravity, he beats anything that I know of. He is apt to do anything, except a good thing, at any moment. When he appears most serenely unconscious, look out for him, for that is the hour in which he meditates some diabolical action. He bucks when he is ridden and balks when he is driven, but once get him going and he shows his mettle. He can go, and go like the wind, and go all day, and live on one blade of grass and one drop of dew, and keep awake all night, and keep you awake too, and go again all next day, and keep it up until he tires out everything and everybody in competition with him. For when you get him started, you can absolutely depend upon him. He never gets sick, nor breaks down, and I do not believe he ever dies. But it is awfully hard getting him started sometimes. I knew a missionary party that had a pair of broncos, one of which could be started only in one way. The other, of course, was in sympathy with and regulated his movements by his companion. Two disinterested people who were not going with the party would pass the bight of a stout rope around the hind fetlocks of the recalcitrant animal, and each take one end and saw away until you could almost smell the burning hair, when without one word of warning the beast would bolt, and from that time would go all day, cheerfully, at the liveliest kind of a trot, provided they were not halted for anything. If they were stopped, the same process would have to be gone over with again. Moral suasion was entirely lost on these horses, yet you could not help liking them. They were so mean they were actually charming. I never shall forget the first time that I ever threw my leg across the back of one of these animals. He bucked just one buck. I did not stay with him more than a second, but the impression he made in that second was a lasting one. I can feel it yet. Coal Oil Johnny and his bronco reminded me of my first service in the Territory. All that I asked of the people who came to the services, including a large number of cowboys, was that they should pay my traveling expenses, my support being provided elsewhere. After the services I noted that the offering amounted to less than $1, which was not nearly enough. I stepped out among the congregation and told them the facts, and stated that I had heard of the proverbial generosity of the cowboys, and in other places experienced it, but that it did not seem to be a quality of the men before me. There was a pause for a moment, and the nearest man walked up and put $1 in the collection basket. His example was followed by others, until there were a number of silver dollars there, and I never had occasion to speak on the subject in that town again. I am very fond of the genuine cowboy, now fast disappearing. I've ridden and hunted with him, eaten and laughed with him, camped and slept with him, wrestled and prayed with him, and I always found him a rather good sort, fair, honorable, generous, kindly, loyal to his friends, his own worst enemy. The impression he makes on civilization when he rides through a town in a drunken revel, shooting miscellaneously at everything, is a deservedly bad one, I grant you, but you should see him on the prairie in a round-up or before a stampede. There is a man and a hero. Speaking of collections, a man came up to me one day after service and was pleased to address me in this manner. "Say, parson, that there service and sermon was grand. I wouldn't have missed 'em for $5. When I suggested that he hand me the difference between the amount he had put in the collection and the figure he mentioned for my missionary work, he stopped suddenly, looked at me with his mouth wide open, and then slowly pulled from his pocket $4.90, which he handed to me without a word. He, like many others, resembled that old woman who said she had been a Christian for 50 years, and she thanked God it had never cost her a cent. I used to have other weddings from time to time, and on one occasion I had 2 in the same town on the same day, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. The first wedding fee I received was $10, a very large remuneration for the place and people. After the second wedding, the best man called me into a private room and thus addressed me. "What's the tax, parson?" "Anything you like, or nothing at all," I answered. I have frequently received nothing. "Now," said he, "we want to do this thing up in style, but I have had no experience in this business and do not know what is proper. You name your figure." I suggested that the legal charge was $2. "Pshaw!" he said, "this ain't legal. We want to do something handsome." "Go ahead and do it," I said, whereupon he reflected a moment and then asked me how much I had received for the wedding of the morning. $10, I replied. His face brightened at once. Here was a solution to the difficulty. "I'll see his ante," he remarked. "Raise him $5 and call." Whereupon he handed me $15. The first wedding I ever had was the marriage of a cable car gripman and a little dressmaker. The man disconcerted me greatly by repeatedly urging me before and during the ceremony to hurry up, as he only had a lay off for one trip. When I finished he said he would see me next week, but that next week has never come around. The churches in the West suffer greatly from cyclones, properly called tornadoes, though I shall use the popular name. During the 4 years in which I was connected with one diocese as its archdeacon, we lost one church every year from that cause. The dwelling houses and other buildings of a great many of our adherents were wrecked, and in several instances some of them lost their lives. One Sunday I was called upon to preach a memorial sermon for a young woman who had been killed in one of these cyclones. She was a schoolmistress and was boarding around. With something like a dozen people, I forget the exact number, she was caught in a large house, which stood on the edge of a high bluff, by a tremendous cyclone. The house was completely wrecked, and every inmate of it, except one, was killed immediately, or died within an hour or so. The one who survived, though badly injured, said that the family were at supper when the storm struck the house, that the little schoolmistress happened to sit next the omnipresent baby at the table in its high chair. When they found the poor girl that night she was still alive, though unconscious, and she died almost instantly. The awful force of the wind had torn from her person everything she had on, including 2 rings, except one shoe. Her hair was actually whipped to rags. She had been driven through several barbed wire fences, and every bone in her body was broken. In her arms, however, and clasped tightly to her breast, was the dead body of that little infant. Womanlike, she had seized the child when she felt the shock of the storm, and not even the tornado itself had been strong enough to tear the baby from her arms. It was a splendid example of that altruistic instinct of womanhood upon which religion and society depend. Dead on the field of honor, little mistress of a larger school. Blessed is her name among those who knew her, and this will give a wider circulation to this story of everyday heroism. All the other churches closed their doors on this occasion and united with us in doing honor to this heroic girl. The first visit the bishop of that missionary jurisdiction made in that town, he had to bury, I think, 19 victims of that cyclone. One of the churches we lost had just been completed a second time after having been partially destroyed previously by fire. About 15 feet away from the church was a little ramshackle 3-roomed house of the flimsiest construction which was used for the rectory. Save the mark! Between the two stood a large maple tree, certainly a foot in diameter. That cyclone tore the church building to pieces. There was not a single piece of timber left standing, and even the stones of the foundation wall were scattered all over the adjoining country. That tree next to the church was twisted off about 6 feet from the ground, and the whole top disappeared, we knew not where. The end that stood in the air was shivered like a paint-brush. And the little rickety house, not 10 feet from the tree, and which a strong man might almost have toppled over, was not injured in the slightest degree. Oh, but the people of that mission were plucky. They had lost the first church by fire, the second by cyclone, and the wind had hardly died down before they commenced to lay plans and raise money. That was the first thing, of course, to build again. All the communicants were women. There were 1 or 2 men who helped a little, but the bulk of the work was done by the women. Their religious services had been carried on by a lay reader, quite the most inefficient one I ever saw, who was a candidate for orders. He had been transferred to us from another diocese farther east, and we had but little opportunity to try his mettle. We got all sorts of queer things unloaded upon us from the east, including clergymen. Bishop Williams is reported as having looked back with great satisfaction on the number of men he kept out of the ministry, on account of their manifest unfitness, of course. We used to think that many of those he did not keep out came out west. The regular clergy and missionaries were as noble and able and devoted a body of men as any with whom I ever came in contact, but deliver me from those who came west because they failed east. That kindly bishop sometimes palmed them off on their poorer western brethren did not help matters at all. This particular lay reader came up for examination shortly after the cyclone, and his ignorance was painful and pitiable. The chief examiner of that diocese, a venerable and learned old priest, asked him as the first question, "Where was our Saviour born?" A look of deep anxiety spread over the face of the young man, who groped around in his mind in painful silence, and finally said hesitatingly, "Well, I do not believe I know where he was born. I think it maybe was in Jerusalem." "That will do, sir," said the chief examiner, sadly but firmly. "I will not continue the examination any further." The entire unfitness of the young man was made manifest by other circumstances as well. Their experience with him, the people said, had been worse than with the cyclone. When he was dropped, they were put on my list by the bishop for occasional services until I could get them a clergyman. They fitted up the little rectory as a chapel, and began to raise funds for a new church building. When they were in a fair way of completing the desired sum, the city chose to pave the streets around the church, which took all they had in the bank. Nothing daunted, however, they still persisted, and now they have a very pretty little church, a resident clergyman, regular services, and as many men communicants as women. I do not know of anything pluckier than their long fight. They have learned something, too, and in addition to a fire they carry cyclone insurance. I have known cyclones to play some strange pranks. On one occasion 2 horses were lifted up in the air and carefully deposited, unharmed, in a walled field about 1/8 of a mile away. I saw them there. I have seen chickens and geese with every feather torn off of them, picked clean, and still feebly alive. One house, I remember, had a hole about 10 feet in diameter cut out of its roof as if by a circular saw, evidently by the very tip end of the funnel. It was otherwise untouched. I have seen the black whirling cloud sweeping through a valley at a terrific rate, its fell progress marked by the destruction it caused as it actually leaped and bounded through the air. I saw that one pick up an outbuilding and apparently lift it up and shake it to pieces as one shakes a pepper box. One of the worst ones I ever knew tossed a heavy iron safe about as a child might a wooden alphabet block in play. I have known of a house wrecked and all of its inmates killed, and other instances where no one was hurt, although the building was literally blown away from them. When buildings were completely torn to pieces, they frequently presented the appearance of having been wrecked by some inside explosion, especially if they had been shut up when the storm broke. Of all the manifestations of power that I ever witnessed, and I happen to have seen almost everything, from an earthquake down, except a volcano in eruption, a cyclone or tornado is the most appalling. The midnight blackness of the funnel, the lightning darting from it in inconceivable fierceness, the strange crackling sound which permeates it, the suddenness of the irresistible attack, its incredibly swift motion, its wild leaping and bounding like a gigantic, ravening beast of prey, the destruction of its progress, the awful roar which follows it, the human lives taken in the twinkling of an eye, the wreck of property and fortune in its trail, may God deliver us from that mighty besom of wrath and destruction. End of chapter 4.